Let's come back to our historical sources. Several traditions were embedded within the biography of Jeremiah, from which we can reconstruct a Babylonian decision and actual practical actions to establish alternative center to Jerusalem even before the destruction of the city. The main evidence of the existence of an organized, authoritative Jewish group on the eve of the destruction of Jerusalem is found in a description of Jeremiah's last attempt to convince Zedekiah to leave the city and surrender to the Babylonians in the hope of preventing the destruction. You can read it in Jeremiah 38 verses 14 to 28. In response to the prophet's words in Jeremiah 38 verses 17 and 18, according to which, and I'm reading from this verse. ויאמר ירמיהו אל צדקיהו, כה אמר אדוני אלוהי צבאות אלוהי ישראל, אם יצא תצא אל שרי מלך בבל, וחייתה נפשך, והעיר הזאת לא תשרף באש, וחיית אתה וביתך. ואם לא תצא אל שרי מלך בבל, וניתנה העיר הזאת ביד הכסדים, ושרפוה באש, ואתה לא תימלט מידם. The king said, according to verse 19, ויאמר המלך צדקיהו אל ירמיהו, אני דואג את היהודים אשר נפלו אל הכסדים, פן ייתנו אותי בידם והתעללו בי. Zedekiah is referring to a specific group of Judeans who have surrendered the Babylonians and, thus, escaped the misery of life in a city under siege. The emphasis in these words is that this group is in a specific place outside Jerusalem and is being granted by the Babylonians a certain degree of internal autonomy and freedom of action. The king's apprehension is that if he will surrender to the Babylonians, they will deliver him into the hands of this group. This concern attests to the fact that the Babylonians saw this group as a basis for a new system they wished to establish, and that Zedekiah, like Jeremiah, knew of it. Zedekiah's words reveal the existence of two groups with different political orientations. The supporters of the revolt within Jerusalem, and the supporters of capitulation to the Babylonians outside of the city. The hostility between the two groups is highlighted in Zedekiah's great fear that he would be handed over to this group, and it is also evident in the attitude of the Judean officials to Jeremiah. In an attempt to comprehend the process by which the two groups formed, one may point to the remarkable point of departure, the appearance of Egypt in the aid of the besieged Jerusalem. We already read it in the reconstructed according to Jeremiah 37, verse 5 to 11. We also describe the background of the lull in the siege when the Babylonians turned to the battle against the Egyptian army, and the description of Jeremiah's attempt to leave the city, trying to escape from there among the people, and we read it in Jeremiah 37, verse 12. From the account in verses 12 and 13, where Jeremiah is headed to go to the land of Benjamin, and the direction of his exit from the city, and he was in the gate of Benjamin, it's clear that those who left the city headed toward the region of Benjamin. Furthermore, Jeremiah's act is not described as extraordinary. He was seized at the gate of Benjamin among the people departing for the land of Benjamin, only because of the fear of the propaganda effect of his desertion to the Babylonian side. It seems to me that the lull in the siege was a decisive point in time for the crystallization of the group in Mizpah around the leadership of Godolия. The impression is that the group of these Judeans who have deserted to the Chaldeans, according to Jeremiah 38, verse 19, apparently had a specific place in the region of Benjamin where these people had assembled. Their departure from the besieged city and Jeremiah's attempt to join them is evidence of their political inclination and the belief that the revolt was hopeless. It also expressed the connection with the Babylonians and the familiarity with them, as well as the absence of fear of them and the willingness to accept their rule. Jeremiah's confident answer to the king, wherein he replies according to chapter 38, verse 20, Vayomer Yirmiyahu lo itenu, they will not give you up, reflects the prophet's knowledge of the relationship between the Babylonians and this Judean group, and also perhaps his ability to influence that group and thus the fate of the king after his surrender to the Babylonians. It is also on this basis that we can interpret the episode described in Jeremiah 32, which, according to the opening verses 1 to 5, took place after the prophet was arrested by the officials when he tried to escape from Jerusalem and was placed in the court of the guard. הדבר אשר היה אל ירמיהו מאת אדוני, בשנה העשירית לצדקיהו מלך יהודה, היא השנה 18 לנבוכדנצר. ואז חיל מלך בבל צרים על ירושלים, וירמיהו הנביא היה כלוא בחצר המטרה, אשר בית מלך יהודה. The story is about purchasing a field in Jeremiah's hometown, Anatot, which is in the land of Benjamin. Take a minute and read few verses from Jeremiah 32 in order to know what is the story all about. You can press the pause button. The emphasis in verse 8 on the location of the field in Anatot, which is in the land of Benjamin, attests to the time when the distinction was created between the fate of the Benjamin region, which is not part of the area destroyed by the Babylonians, and the fate of Jerusalem and the rest of the lands of Judah. This contrast is highlighted in verses 24 and 25. הנה הסוללות באו העיר ללכדה, והעיר ניתנה ביד הכסדים הנלחמים עליה, מפני החרב והרעב והדבר, ואשר דיברת היה, והנך רואה. ואתה אמרת אליי, אדוני אלוהים, קנה לך השדה בכסף, והעד עדים, והעיר ניתנה ביד הכסדים. These verses reflect the parallel that the author draws between the future fate of the entire country and the present fate of the land of Benjamin. In light of the possibility of buying field in the land of Benjamin in his lifetime, Jeremiah prophesies in verse 15 that כי כה אמר אדוני צבאות אלוהי ישראל, עוד יקנו בתים ושדות וכרמים בארץ הזאת. This is the background against which the prophet summarizes the future anticipated for the entire country. שדות בכסף יקנו, וכתוב בספר וכתום והעד עדים בארץ בנימין ובסביבי ירושלים ובערי יהודה ובערי ההר ובערי השפלה ובערי הנגב, כי אשיב את שבותם, נאום אדוני. Support for this may be found in archaeological findings that show that there is almost total settlement continuity in the Benjamin region throughout most of the 6th century BCE. We will deal with it in the 6th part of this course. It is difficult to detach these prophecies from the establishment of the center at Mitzpah at the same time, from the appointment of Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, as governor, and from Jeremiah's own attempt to move to Mitzpah even before the destruction of Jerusalem. The prophet's behavior afterwards, too, as described further on in the biography, particularly in chapter 38, verses 14 to 28, confirms that for him the die had been cast. Jerusalem was to be laid waste. At this stage, the prophet is looking toward the future, and he knows that the task of rebuilding a nation is the central task that its leaders must assume. This is why the prophet continues to struggle against the officials and attempts to bring about the capitulation of the city and thus to save it from its fate. According to Jeremiah 38, verse 27, when the officials question him about his conversation with the king, he lies to them as commanded by the king, reading verses 25-26, and doesn't repeat his real words. In response, the officials, and I'm reading in 38 verses 27, ויבואו כל השרים אל ירמיהו וישאלו אותו, ויגד להם ככל הדברים האלה אשר ציווה המלך. ויחרישו ממנו, כי לא נשמע הדבר. It is not known how much time passed between that and the final destruction of Jerusalem, but whatever the prophet did, he, according to chapter 38, verse 28, וישב ירמיהו בחצר המטרה עד יום אשר נלכדה ירושלים. Additional support for the existence of the new Judahite center at Mitzpah even before the destruction of Jerusalem can be found in the description of the transfer of Jeremiah to Mitzpah immediately after the destruction, when the new center of government in the early days of Gedaliah's reign was already standing. Two parallel versions of this event have been preserved that were incorporated into the biography, and they represent the information available on the fate of Jeremiah immediately after the destruction. The parallel historical kernel in both traditions includes a description of the prophet being removed from his place of arrest in Jerusalem by senior Babylonian agents, Nebuzaradan or other Babylonian officials, and being sent to the new center in Mitzpah. From the Babylonians' perspective, sending the prophet to Mitzpah suited the policy of establishing Mitzpah as a new center because it is reasonable to assume that he was well known as a person who had struggled for many long years on behalf of the sane, realistic policy, and that he had supported capitulation to the Babylonians. In addition to that, Jeremiah maintained close relation with the various branches of the family of Shaphan, the scribe. And it is probable that Gedaliah himself needed the presence of an influential figure like Jeremiah. His transfer to Mitzpah by the Babylonians was a measure designed to strengthen support for the new government and to give Gedaliah moral and religious backing at that difficult time when the rule of the house of David had been abolished, the capital devastated, and the kingdom put to an end. For our purpose, the account of Jeremiah's transfer to Mitzpah immediately after the destruction demonstrated that this center was standing already. The proximity of events, the destruction of Jerusalem, the deportation to Babylonia, and the transfer of Jeremiah to Mitzpah is not explicit in both versions of the narrative, and the background for both is the days immediately after the destruction. It is hard to assume that this chronology of event is the result of narrative reworking or filling in the lacune, because it is the clear groundwork of both versions in Jeremiah. The presence of Gedaliah in Mitzpah is described at this stage as implicitly understood. He is defined as a person of authority into whose keeping Jeremiah could be sent, and the center in Mitzpah is an existing place where Jeremiah could be transferred so that he would dwell among the people. Well, we are coming to the conclusions of this unit, the last one in this fourth part of the course. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple as well. The Davidic house and many of the Jerusalemite elite were exiled, and in Judah, the center was transferred to Mitzpah, Gedaliah was nominated as the first Judahite governor, and the new period in the nation's history just begun. After the summary, this will be in the focus of the next part of this course.